My first mistake was ignoring the red flags. I met my husband when I was an 18-year-old waitress in a Mexican restaurant. He was a 21-year-old bartender, and the first time I saw him behind the bar, I was scared to approach him. I literally felt a block, a resistance to go near. His face was hard and stern, his shoulders were tight, his demeanor was unfriendly. My first instinct was to withdraw, to back away. This was the first way I failed my marriage, and we hadn't even officially met yet, much less gotten married. I felt a resistance when I first saw him. My energy just was not on the same wavelength as his, and yet I kept moving forward. I ignored my instincts and all the red flags that were flapping around me. The second way I failed my marriage, even before we got married, was that I married because I was lonely, insecure, and afraid. My husband and I were friends for 17 years before we got married. We'd go drinking and camping together. I never wanted to date him, and I could never see myself in a relationship with him, much less being married to him. Our friendship dwindled when I moved to Africa for 3 years. I was 33 when I returned to Canada, and I hadn't had a long-term boyfriend for years. I was desperate to get married. I'd grown up with a single schizophrenic mom, no dad, no normal family or home life. I always felt weird and abnormal, sometimes even crazy. I felt like I was getting old and I needed to get married, so I called my old friend, who became my husband, and I initiated a relationship. He proposed a few months after we reconnected. And that's the second way I failed my husband and our marriage. I didn't stop and think before I accepted his proposal. Although I have to say that I did have a whole weekend of doubts. The weekend before our wedding, I almost called it off, but I couldn't because the invitations were already out. Everybody was already planning on coming. How could I change my mind about getting married? The third way I failed my marriage is that I suppressed my thoughts and feelings a lot. My husband and I are very different people. We have completely different outlooks on life, spirituality, recreation, politics, people, the environment, and even just daily chores. Instead of sharing my opinion or initiating conversations about things we disagreed on, I just suppressed how I felt. For example, during an election, I came home to a political party's sign on our lawn. I was surprised. I thought the party or the candidate had placed it there without permission. When I mentioned it to my husband, he said he donated money to the party and told them they could put the sign on our lawn. I was shocked, and it had nothing to do with politics. I couldn't care less who he votes for. What shocked me was that he saw no problem with donating money to a political party and giving them permission to put a sign out without mentioning it to me. My reluctance to share my honest thoughts and feelings about that and other things was the third way I failed our marriage. I brushed off my hopes and my desires for a truly loving, committed, open, communicative relationship, and I just sort of went my own way. The fourth way that I let my side of the partnership down was that I focused on the failing or the bad parts of our marriage. My husband and I are compatible financially. We both like to volunteer and cook together and drink wine. He's responsible and loyal, committed to family, trustworthy, dependable, and reliable. I always knew he'd make a great husband for somebody. I failed my marriage by focusing on what was going wrong. Instead of celebrating what we did well together, I allowed the negative parts of being married crowd in and take over. The fifth way I failed is that I didn't try to help my husband understand how unhappy I was. We had both been unhappy in our marriage for several years before I initiated a separation. Looking back, I can't believe we were unhappily married for that long. But I also know some couples live together unhappily for decades. We congratulate them on being married for 50, 60, even 70 years, but do we ask how happy they were as a husband and wife? I was deeply unhappy in our marriage, but my husband didn't know how bad I felt. He was unhappy too, but he would have stayed married forever. He could have lived with our marriage the way it was. I couldn't. I didn't even try to convince him how happy I was, partly because I just assumed we'd go along unhappily for the rest of our lives. It took me a full year to realize and accept the idea that I could leave. I didn't have to stay in an unhappy marriage. The sixth way that I failed is that I withdrew. I withdrew from doing activities together. I stopped going to his families for Christmas and different types of holidays. Not only did I lose interest in doing things with my husband, even going to church or to his family home in a different province for the holidays, I started doing most things alone. Overall, this wasn't too unusual for me. I'd always been independent and curious about life, experiences, and travel. I had no problem being alone. But I failed my marriage by not spending enough time with my husband. I didn't make it a priority to try and work on our relationship or even try to remember our past enjoyable moments. The problem was that when we did do stuff together that was supposed to be fun, such as hosting neighborhood parties or taking a day trip to celebrate his birthday out of town, it was painful. We just had such different expectations and ways to respond to things that happen that neither of us were happy together. We were just happier doing our own thing. The final way I failed to try to save my marriage was by not insisting on couples or marriage counseling. When our relationship started making me feel really uncomfortable and unhappy, I had suggested marriage counseling. I reached out to a church elder and asked for help finding a counselor. We received an invitation to take a marriage course through the church, but neither my husband nor I was interested because we'd already taken the marriage course and we knew it wasn't going to give us what we needed. A year or so later, I suggested formal marriage counseling to my husband. He said it'd be hard because of COVID, and I found it a lot easier to agree with him than to insist we try. So I suppressed my thoughts and opinions again, and I just went my own way. My marriage failed, but I don't believe it was all my fault. And also, I don't actually believe it was a failure. I don't regret marrying my husband, and I probably would do it again if I was in the same boat that I was 17 years ago. My marriage taught me so much about myself, and I've learned how I tend to operate in relationships and with people. I learned how much I suppress myself and how scared I am to tell the truth about what I really think and feel. And I learned how to be authentic and real and allow people to leave me if they need to. It's important for me to look back and see with all the things that I regret, things that I would have done differently, in order to move on in a fresh, healthy, new way in the future. If you're questioning or struggling with one of your relationships, I encourage you to think about the things that you are doing to contribute to the failure. I'm not saying it's your fault or that you should take all the blame. I just think it's so important and so healthy to be self-aware enough to see where you're going off track. Then you can put yourself back on track in any way that you need to. This may mean trying to save your marriage, or it could mean separating or even leaving a relationship that was very important to you for a long time. I wish you warmth, blessing, love, and grace as you move forward in your life. And I encourage you to take good care of yourself, because you are worth taking good care of. Mwah!